Well, good morning, everyone. You know, I was actually a little bit sad preparing this message throughout the week, because it's never easy saying goodbye to someone or to a group of people. But it kind of felt that way with this message. It felt like it's like we're saying goodbye to the Ephesians after spending quite a bit of time with them. You see, this is number 40 in our series through Ephesians. Sermon number 40. I looked through the archive to see the date for when sermon number 1 was, when we first started the series, and it was actually back on the 18th of June of last year, right? And so it's been over a year that we've been with Paul and with the Ephesians. And you're probably wondering, well, what's next? What series, what book of the Bible are we looking at next? Please come next week so you can find out. I'm not going to tell you now. You're going to have to come back. But this last message in Ephesians, we're going to spend our final moments with someone who I dare say you haven't spent much time with before, because he's not that well known. He's not really mentioned that much at all, and yet without this guy, we perhaps would never have even gotten the letter of Ephesians, because without him, this letter may never have even gotten to Ephesus in the first place. Let me show you what I mean and who we're talking about. We're in the last few verses of the letter, chapter 6 of Ephesians. And if you know anything about Paul and his letters, well, then you know that he usually concludes his letters with a greeting, sometimes with a word of encouragement or with a short blessing, benediction, sometimes even with a brief word about his travel plans of wanting to go and visit the church that he's writing to go and see them in person. But this time was a little different. We know that he can't go to them. And we know this because of verse 20, where Paul says that he is, remember, he says, I am an ambassador in chains. In other words, he's in prison, probably under house arrest, somewhere in Rome. And the reason for being in these chains was because he was unwavering in his commitment to share the gospel with whoever would listen. And so he was an ambassador for the gospel, an ambassador for Christ, but he was in chains though, which, as you can imagine, make traveling a little difficult. But thankfully, Paul had some pretty incredible friends, partners in the gospel, partners in ministry, people he could depend on, trust, friends who were there for Paul when he needed them the most. In fact, the kind of partners in ministry, the kind of friends in ministry that you and I should really long to have here in Alloa. Let's pick it up from verse 21, where Paul tells us about one such friend. He writes, so that you also may know how I am and what I am doing, Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will tell you everything. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. Here is perhaps the first and most important question of this whole message. How do you even say that guy's name? Right? I mean, some have pronounced it as Tychicus. Others say that it's Tychicus. But the way I learnt it, and I've always said it, is Tychicus. And so let's stick with that. He'll be known as Tychicus. And from now on, that's how I'll be referring to him this morning, because we're going to say his name quite a bit. And so this morning, I'd simply like us to learn some lessons from the life of Tychicus. What was it about this beloved brother that got him mentioned in the scriptures, that got him included in this wonderful list of unsung heroes of the faith? I mean, we've heard about the heroes of the faith, right? You know, we always talk about Abraham and Moses and David, but then there's the unsung heroes of the faith. Someone that most of us would know very little about and yet are worth remembering and celebrating. And according to Paul, Tychicus was someone like that. Someone worth remembering and celebrating. But now, before spending some time with Tychicus, just a quick word about Paul. We could say, just a quick lesson from the heart of Paul for the people that he loved and served. I mean, look at verse 22 again and notice what Paul is most concerned about and why he sends Tychicus to Ephesians, to the Ephesus at all. He writes, I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. You see, Paul knows that the Ephesians must be worried, concerned about him. They know he's in prison. They know under what conditions. And he's like, I'm going to tell you how I'm doing, but not for my sake. Not because I'm needing any comfort or support or anything like that from you. No. Instead, I want to tell you how I'm doing for your sake. Despite whatever circumstances Paul was going through, he was more concerned to make sure that their hearts were comforted. He was less concerned about his own circumstances, more concerned about how his circumstances may have been affecting them. What a perspective to have, right? Imagine if more of us were less concerned about what we don't have or what we're going through, and more concerned about others and their needs, but also what my role might be in bringing some comfort to their hearts. You know what that would look like if more of us took on that perspective? It would simply look like a church seeking to follow in the steps of our Lord Jesus. I can think of a very clear example of how he showed this. You see, in John chapter 19, we get this incredible exchange between Jesus and his mother Mary, and also with John, one of his closest disciples. But this wasn't just any exchange, because it takes place while Jesus is hanging on the cross. He's on the cross, dying, suffering in agony, paying the penalty for the sins of the world. And yet, even in that moment, he's concerned about others. He's thinking about others and their needs. And specifically, he's thinking about his own mother. Notice what it says there in John chapter 19. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Probably pointing to John in that moment. Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. Despite his own suffering, despite his own current situation, he was still thinking about how to comfort and bless and take care of others, which is the same heart that Paul has here for the Ephesians, and which is the same heart that I hope we might have for each other here at Aloha, which is perhaps even the same heart that I'm hoping we as a church would have for the missionaries we support. Because just as a side note, think about this. What Paul is wanting to give the Ephesians here, it's kind of like a report, right? You know, the report that missionaries often send back to their churches. You see, the Ephesians, like a good sending church, were concerned about Paul. And they would have been concerned about things like, how is he doing? How's his health? Is he eating enough? Does he have enough clothes? Does he have everything he needs? So whether it's the missionaries that you are supporting through us, the church, or perhaps missionaries that you may support personally, I wonder if that's the kind of concern that you have for them. Eager to find out how they're doing, how the work is going, how's their health, how are the kids adapting? Do they have everything they need? So here's my hope. My hope is that when those reports do come from some of our missionaries like Ben and Ali in France, or perhaps from other missionaries that you might support, well then perhaps, based on this relationship that the Ephesians had with Paul, we might wait for those reports and then read those reports with just as much eagerness and just as much anticipation, but then more than that, perhaps we might take it one step further and ask ourselves, like Paul asked himself, what could be my role? What could my role be in bringing some comfort to their hearts? Could be practical, could be financial, could also be through prayer, or even just through a simple message of encouragement to them. So that's what Paul is doing through this letter, showing us his heart for the Ephesians, showing us that he was more concerned with comforting them than even with his own situation. So much so that he asks his dear friend Tychicus to make the long, difficult, arduous trek all the way to Ephesus so that the Ephesians wouldn't be left wondering, but instead so that their hearts would be left encouraged and comforted. So that's kind of one side, quick lesson from the heart of Paul. Despite his own current situation, he was still thinking about how to comfort and bless and take care of others. How about just a couple more then? But this time from the life of our friend Tychicus. What do we know about this man Tychicus? Well, we don't know too much, except that he's mentioned around 5 times in the Bible. We know that it's likely that Tychicus traveled with Paul for most of his journeys. He was with Paul probably during his imprisonment. It's likely that Tychicus was the one who delivered at least 5 letters of the New Testament, letters of Paul to various churches like Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, 2 Timothy, and even Titus. But now get this, please hear this. When we read of all those adventures that Paul went through, we read of those in 2 Corinthians 11, right? Where he details just how hard these missionary journeys actually were, like having to go through imprisonments. He talks about countless near-death beatings, lashes and rods. He talks about having to fight off thieves, sleepless nights, going hungry and thirsty. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, it's like a movie, right? He got shipwrecked 3 times and one time spent 24 hours adrift at sea. But now when we read of all of Paul's adventures and sufferings, we need to understand that most likely this man Tychicus experienced much of it himself alongside Paul. So it's no wonder that Paul would call this man a faithful brother whom he loved dearly. My beloved brother. I mean, who wouldn't love to have a Tychicus in their lives, right? Someone willing to stand with you, to join with you, not only in the joys and successes of ministry, but also willing to stand with you and to join you in the struggles, in the sufferings of ministry. How good would it be to have a Tychicus with us all the time? It would be amazing. But unfortunately, that's simply out of our control, isn't it? You see, we can't control whether or not we'll ever have a Tychicus in our lives. But here's something that is up to us. You and I ourselves could become a Tychicus. We could be known as a beloved brother or sister, known as a faithful servant. And here's how we could go about that. Here's the first lesson that we can draw from the life of Tychicus. Tychicus didn't need any recognition. Simply, if he saw a need he could meet, he would just go ahead and meet it. Here's what I think, and this is just speculation. But I reckon that God inspired Paul to include this man's name here in Ephesians. It's included for the encouragement of people like you and me. Men and women in the church who no one will ever really know about, no one will ever remember us. I mean, think about it. In 2,000 years from now, right, which is roughly back when Ephesians were around, in 2,000 years from now, will anyone still be talking about or even know about any of our work or service here at Aloha? Probably not. And yet Paul includes Tychicus here as a way of reminding us that there is someone who sees it. There is someone who will remember it, all of it. In fact, we're told that God will not overlook your work and the love that you have shown for His name in serving the saints. God will not overlook any of it. And so in the same way that Tychicus is recorded here as a way of saying that God will not overlook his work and his love for Paul and his service of the saints, well, in the same way through Tychicus, I believe God is wanting to encourage each one of us this morning by saying, you know what, others might not see it, but I see it. I see the love you have for the church and for the saints. I see your faithful and tireless service, hours perhaps spent here even before this service begins. Hours spent in various ministries throughout the week. Time spent at home preparing for a kid's lesson or for a sermon or in hosting people or in visiting people in hospital. Others may overlook it, but God will not overlook it. Because like Tychicus, your work and your service, as great or as small as it may be, whether the whole church knows about it or whether 0 people know about it, what matters is that God knows about it and he will remember it. Tychicus didn't need any recognition or accolades, and yet Tychicus was the first one in the trenches with you when he saw some need that he was able to meet. You know, it's been said that there are 2 types of people who walk through the door of a church. One type thinks, here I am, church, ready for you to meet my needs. The other type walks in, looks around and asks, where are the needs that I can meet? The first type, they often leave the church disappointed because the church just simply isn't going to meet all of your needs. But the second type, that's the heart of Tychicus. They're not here only to be served. They are here to serve Christ by serving his people. So here's a question to ask yourself this morning. It's a sobering question. I don't think that's the question. That's not the question. But is there a question that says this? It's just more impact if it was on the screen as well. If every church member were just like me, what kind of church would my church be? Ignore that question. That's coming up soon. That's a preview for. But just think about this. If every church member were just like you and I, what kind of church would we be? It's a sobering question. There's, say, 80, 100 of us here this morning make up this church. What kind of church? Is that the kind of church, if everyone was just like you, is that the kind of church that you'd want us to become? Is that the kind of church you'd want to be a part of? So that's the first lesson that we can draw from the life of Tychicus. Tychicus didn't need any recognition. If he saw a need that he could meet, well, then he would just go ahead and meet it. The next lesson we can draw from Tychicus is this. Tychicus was faithful and dependable in the big things and in the small things. I'd like us to notice something that happens over in 2 Timothy. And this is another one of those places where Paul mentions our friend Tychicus. He writes, Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. So when you come, Timothy, when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas and the books and above all the parchments. You see, what's important to understand what's going on here is that Paul is writing to Timothy, right? And you know who Timothy actually was? I don't know if you knew this. Fun fact, Timothy was actually the pastor at the church of Ephesus. But now why is Paul telling Timothy that he's sending Tychicus to Ephesus? Well, we get a pretty good idea just a few verses earlier. Paul says to Timothy, essentially, he's like, do your best to come and see me soon, he says. Why so much urgency? Well, remember, Timothy was Paul's son in the faith. So Paul naturally wants to see him, catch up with him, enjoy fellowship, mutual encouragement with his son in the faith, Timothy. Timothy, do your best to come and see me soon. But now think about this. If you're pastoring a church, well, then you're naturally going to have some questions, right? If you're Timothy. Paul, but I've got a church to take care of, right? I have people to disciple. I've got sermons to write. Which is why, basically, Paul tells Timothy there in verse 12, well, don't worry, because I'm sending Tychicus to Ephesus. You can leave the church in his very capable hands so that you can come and visit me. Now, here's why I bring this up. I don't want us to take and leave with the wrong impression about our friend Tychicus either, right? And say that he was only gifted in a supporting role or just to be behind the scenes. Paul seems to have such confidence in Tychicus and finds him so trustworthy and so reliable and evidently gifted enough that he would send him to a church like Ephesus to take on the role of interim pastor. That's no small role. That's a big responsibility, to be the interim pastor of such an influential church like Ephesus. And yet, Tychicus was up to the task. Remember, if there was a need he could meet, he would meet it. But now notice something else about Tychicus, though, as mentioned back in our Ephesians passage. You see, back in our Ephesians passage this time, he's about to send Tychicus there, but for a different reason. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. You see, this time, he's not going to be an interim pastor, but to deliver a letter and to give a report on how Paul is doing. In other words, he could be counted on to be the interim pastor in the church if that's what you needed him for. Or he could be counted on to be like the mailman, right? The postman, carrying Paul's letter and message if that's what you needed of him. He was just as willing to shepherd the flock or to preach the word as he was to make the long journey from Rome to Ephesus to deliver a letter from Paul. Because Tychicus was faithful and dependable in the big things and in the small things. And he carried out whatever task he was given, whatever the task, with an equal amount of love and care. Because ultimately, it was all for the Lord, wasn't it? It was all for the Lord. You know, for some reason, some people here in the church have come to see me as like the chair Nazi or something like that, or a bit of a dictator, right, when it comes to setting up the chairs and how the chairs are placed. First of all, if anyone's ever been offended, because you set out the chairs and then I've moved them, I'd like to apologize to you publicly. It wasn't my intention ever to offend anyone. But as I was thinking on this point, I was asking myself, why is it I care so much about how chairs are put out? Or whether the floors need to be vacuumed before people come into the church, or any other seemingly small or insignificant task in the church. Could it really just be my OCD, or is there more to it? Well, I think Tychicus was so helpful to me this week. Because whether there's something behind the scenes, like posting some mail or setting up some chairs, or something more up front, like teaching the kids, preparing a sermon, or even pastoring a church. For Tychicus, there was no job too big or too small. And whatever the task, he put in equal amount of faithfulness, love, and care into each one of those tasks, because ultimately we do it as unto the Lord. It's all for him. And so here's another question for you to ask this morning, and you've already seen this one. Is there a job too big or perhaps too small for you here in the church? Or you know what? Maybe you're not sure. Maybe you're not sure if there is a job too big or too small because you're not involved in anything. And if that's you, come and see us and we'll give you a job as big or as small as you're comfortable with. But the point is, as long as you're involved in something, and then you're able to carry out that task as unto the Lord. So that's a second lesson that we can take from the life of Tychicus. Tychicus was faithful and dependable in the big things and in the small things. And then finally, Finally, one last simple lesson that we can draw from the life of Tychicus. Tychicus was remembered well by those who knew him. Tychicus was remembered well by those who knew him. I think most of us, there's no argument here, most of us would agree that our goal in life should be to honor the Lord Jesus Christ, and that it's his name that we are working towards being made known. It's his name we want remembered, not ours. We know that, we agree at that. But at the same time though, and I think we get this from the fact that Tychicus is included here, the fact that God decided to include him in the scriptures at all, at the same time, I don't think it's a bad thing to have a genuine desire to be remembered well by those who knew us best. To be thought of well, spoken of well by those who were closest to us when we do go on and pass on to glory and we're no longer around. You see, the reality is the reputation you are building right now, the reputation you are building right now, that's what will determine ultimately how we are going to be remembered later. We don't get to live our lives in one way and then expect to be remembered differently once we're gone. It just doesn't work like that. And so what was it about Tychicus that got him remembered all these years later and now has all of us thinking and speaking well about him this morning? Well, based on what we've already seen, we know what it was about him. Firstly, and this can be you and I, that's the challenge. Firstly, if he saw a need that he could meet, well, then he would meet it. Secondly, what has us thinking and remembering so well? He was faithful and dependable in the big things and in the small things. And then ultimately, the end result of choosing to live this way was that he would be remembered well by those who knew him. And so as the music team come up and they come and lead us in one more song. Come up to the front, yep. Is Grace anywhere around? I needed her to start, but I guess that's not going to happen. Maybe you can do some with her. You know, the emotional effect, pull on the emotional heartstrings just to try to, make the point. Let's just take a moment to reflect on the legacy that you and I are going to be leaving behind. Let's just reflect on the legacy that you and I are going to be leaving behind. How are we going to be remembered? How am I going to be remembered, thought of, spoken about by those who are closest to us once we are no longer around? So what I'm going to do, I want to leave some questions up on the screen just for a moment. Maybe as they start their music, just reflect on these questions for like a minute or two to help us reflect on what kind of legacy will you be leaving behind. What is your reputation like right now? Is your reputation right now, is that how you want to be remembered? Do you consistently live a life of integrity, holiness, purity? Are you faithful in your commitments at home, commitments with family, commitments with church? Are you faithful in those, dependable, reliable? When you walk into the church, are you looking for your needs to be met? Or are you looking for ways to serve the saints?